The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? And that word in Greek for participation is koinonia. It's communion. It's an intense personal participation. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a koinonia in the blood of Christ? Where did he get that phrase, cup of blessing? That's taken straight from the Jewish liturgy of the Passover. Because the cup of blessing, the third cup, the one that Jesus consecrated. And then he goes on, the bread which we break, is it not a participation, a koinonia, a communion in the body of Christ? Aha! Now he's introduced the notion of body of Christ, which he plans to spend the next several chapters developing. And then listen to verse 17. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body. So when Paul finally gets around to introducing an idea that he plans to spend practically the rest of the epistle explaining and developing, what is it that he uses to explain how we are Christ's body? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body. For we all partake of the one bread. Now what is he talking about? This big loaf that the Corinthians bake every Sunday morning just in time for Mass? No, it isn't one big loaf of bread. It is the one Christ who comes to us in the one Eucharist. The cup of blessing that we bless, the bread which we bless, is not this a koinonia, a communion, a participation in the very body and blood of Christ? Not the battered body on the cross that was gasping and bleeding and dying, but the resurrected body of Christ, the ascended body of Christ, the enthroned body of our heavenly high priest, who doesn't just offer, but is the one offered. This is the one who comes to us in the Eucharist. Body, blood, soul, and oh yeah, divinity too. So what is it that makes the church the body of Christ? Because you've got the resurrected physical body up in heaven, and you've got the earthly mystical body of the church on earth. But how does the church on earth become what Christ is in heaven? How does Christ communicate his own glorified body to those of us on earth so that we can become his mystical body? And what's the answer? The Holy Eucharist. We are what we receive. We become what we consume. But it's not just consuming, it's communing with the very body and blood of Christ. You know, we use this phrase, corpus mysticum, in a Latin formula. There's a famous encyclical written by Pope Pius called Mystici Corporis, on the mystical body, written back in the 40s. It was all about the church as the mystical body of Christ. But do you know, there's a theologian by the name of Cardinal de Lubac, and what he did was a historical investigation. He noticed that in the first 1,000 years of the church, you find this phrase mystical body used a lot. And in the second 1,000 years of the church, you find the phrase mystical body used just as much or more. But with one big difference. When Cardinal de Lubac went back to the first 1,000 years, he found hundreds and hundreds of references to the mystical body by St. Augustine and by St. Ambrose and by many others, St. Anselm. But the primary use of the phrase mystical body in the first 1,000 years was used referring to not the church, but the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the mystical body. And then in the second millennium, in the last 1,000 years, theologians have adopted that phrase and have applied it to the church as the mystical body. Well, which is it? A or B? Which is it? The Eucharist or the church? And the answer is clearly C, both A and B. The church is only the mystical body of Christ because of the Eucharistic life and power that Christ communicates to us. This is not symbolism. This is not ritualism. This is reality. The visible form gives us invisible life. The human action of the Eucharistic sacrament is releasing divine energy. What we experience on earth is what takes us to heaven. It isn't simply human, it's primarily divine. Or I like to say it this way, the sacraments are not what we do for God, but as the Catholic Church teaches, they're primarily what God does for us, especially Christ. Christ is the minister of the sacrament. Even more than the priest stands in persona Christi. He's in the person of Christ. That's why the priest doesn't look out to you and say, this is his body, or look up and say, this is your body. He looks out and says, this is my body. Because our priests have given their lips, their lungs, their lives to Christ, so that Jesus is the high priest who speaks through the priests, who gives us nothing less than himself. He is the priest conducting the liturgy. He is the sacrifice that is offered in the liturgy. Christ fulfills it all, but he does it for us. And he does it through the Eucharist. So because there is one bread, we who are many, and aren't we many? I mean, you look around at the Catholics in America and around the world, you know, there was one famous convert in England who, after she came into the church, she described the Catholic Church as, here comes everybody. You get all kinds. You know, all social groups, all nationalities, all temperaments and personalities. You know, I remember what it was like to be an evangelical Protestant. We had a church that was like a health spa because we all had shared the same experience of conversion. We all shared the same basic core beliefs, and we all shared the same excitement when we would come to hear our preacher go for 35, 45, sometimes 55 minutes and opening up the Bible. Can you imagine what would happen to Father Simon if he tried that? Or has he? Yeah, he does, yeah. Well, I mean, you get people who are like-minded, who come from a similar social group, who've had the same spiritual experience. It's like an all-star team. But it's not like a family. Because families, you know, aren't made up of people who kind of all choose each other. I mean, we don't elect our parents. We don't even get the vote for our siblings. In an extended family like God's family, here comes everybody. You know, every race, every nationality, every social class, and every personality type, and we all have to get along. Why? Because we're family. That's why we fight so much, because we're family. You know, who fights like family members? Who disagrees? But who forgives? Who repents? Because we who are many are one body because there is one bread. The Eucharistic body of Christ is what transforms us into the mystical body of Christ. You know, it's usually the other way around. It's usually like the body of the cow is transformed into my body when I eat a Big Mac. But in this case, we become what we eat in the sense that we receive the body of Christ and he is joined to us, but even more, we are joined to him. We become what he is, so that we can go where he is, so that we can become what he has become in glory through his obedience and through his suffering and all of the rest. So, how did Paul prepare the Corinthians to understand this? The Old Testament. What you would expect. Go back to chapter 10, verse 1. I want you to know, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. What is he talking about? The sea, the Red Sea.